comments and challenge speakers on their papers. But now it's my great pleasure to introduce the Forbes Prize Lecture. At every IIC Congress, a distinguished member of the conservation profession is invited to give the Forbes Prize Lecture. The prize is named after Edward Waldo Forbes, born 1873, died 1969, who was director of the Fogg Art Museum at Harvard University from 1909 to 1944, and was the first honorary fellow of IIC in 1958. In the same year, the Forbes Prize Lecture was established by IIC's council to honor him, and it is awarded by council to acknowledge an individual's conspicuous service to conservation. The Forbes Prize Lecture is the highest award that IIC offers internationally. I'm delighted to introduce my good friend and colleague, Stefan Michalski, Fellow of IIC and this year's Forbes Prize Lecturer. Stefan began his career with CCI, the Canadian Conservation Institute, in 1979. We first met when Stefan visited Gary Thompson in the National Gallery London Scientific Department, where I was working in the early 1980s. Stefan is one of those increasingly rare people who have worked their entire career with one organization. He has had a number of roles, all to do with conservation science and preventive conservation. His current job title is Senior Conservation Scientist. Stefan's first degree was a BSc in Physics and Maths from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada, where he also studied for a Masters of Art Conservation with a speciality in artifact conservation. His academic background in physical science has enabled him to bring a rigor into his research into the deterioration of museum objects, and he has made the complex simple, or at least understandable with a bit of effort, for many generations of conservation students and conservators. The framework for preventive conservation developed at CCI has reached all corners of the globe, and most conservators can recite the 9 or 10 agents of deterioration by rote. At the IIC 1994 Congress in Ottawa, Stefan illustrated his talk with a number of props. Most people remember him breaking a painting over his head. For some reason, I have a stronger memory of him wearing an apron and carrying a washing up bowl, allusions to housekeeping and the importance of day-to-day care. Let us find out what fireworks Stefan has to present to us today. He will be speaking for up to 1 hour, and it is the convention for the Forbes Prize Lecture that we do not take questions at the end. But we do have a coffee break, and I'm sure he will be happy to discuss his paper with you then. Stefan.
Thank you, Sarah, for that kind introduction. Unfortunately for theater and drama, I've mellowed since then. I was a bit angry and cranky at the end of that conference. I got over it, but people do remember the painting over the head and the apron. Ladies and gentlemen, and all of those who consider those categories unnecessary or meaningless, I've updated this Nobel Prize winner, some of his poetry. I feel that I've had a successful life, and by that I really mean that I feel I've made a meaningful contribution to the world. I've been lucky enough to be able to go behind the scenes in the old Nash Museum in Cairo before opening hours, getting ready for teaching a class, and to just walk amongst these old cabinets of curiosities displays and to watch the cleaners take the Sahara dust off ancient objects. I've been able to, not just been able, I've been invited to provide advice to places like the Anne Frank House. This is her diary, and to be in the presence of what I still consider to be magical things. I've been able to visit the laboratories in Italy, the OPD here, and to see people deeply involved in the restoration and maintenance of profound works of art. And this is in Caracas, in Venezuela, in a somewhat better time. They'll come out the other side, but this is the Contemporary Art Museum in Caracas, where I was behind a wonderful network sculpture by a local artist. Then this summer, as I was thinking about what to speak about on the Forbes Lecture, I read this book which has come out by David Graeber, who's an anthropologist and a bit of an anarchist, self-admitted. I think Yale fired him because of that, but the London School of Economics, bless their soul, hired him, probably because of that. And he wrote a book called Bullshit Jobs. He'd actually written an article many months earlier saying that it seemed to him in talking to colleagues, especially in the white-collar middle class, that many people considered their work meaningless. They did not feel that their job contributed anything useful to the world, and they were desperately unhappy of it. So actually some governments did polls, because nobody really quite believed how pessimistic he was, and asked people, does your job make a meaningful contribution to the world? So a YouGov poll of UK residents, no, said 37%. The Dutch did one, Schruten and Nielsen, 40%. I was surprised, I thought, and actually so was David Graeber. He said his anecdotal evidence, he didn't think it was that bad, but when somebody did an anonymous poll, it's that bad. So I wondered whether I was just lucky or self-deluded. So I decided to poll people in preventive conservation, treatment conservation, conservation science. I went through the entire member list of IIC and I wrote an email to everyone who listed preventive conservation or who listed conservation science. I selected some in treatment conservation, and I added a lot of colleagues. And friends put them into LinkedIn and Facebook, where they were shared. I had very good response to the email. I received 60 or 70% response, which for a poll is phenomenal. I hope that because the poll was sent to you, some of you who are in this audience, really realized it was anonymous. I know some people kind of felt like, oh God, am I really going to say that's my opinion to Stefan Michalski? I assure you, I don't know what your response was. It's an anonymous email. I suppose if I went to a hacker, I could get the IP address and look it up and see who you are. But I won't, don't worry. So I'm very grateful for people who responded. So one of the questions is, what is the primary kind of work that you do? And it's easy to do these sorts of surveys now and to process them with things like, this was a monkey survey. So does your job make a meaningful contribution to the world? So please put your hands up if you would answer more or less yes to this. Yes? Excellent. Those of you who didn't put up your hands, I'm not going to embarrass you to say, unless you really want to. Anyone want to commit to saying, no, I'm here at this conference, but my job does not make a meaningful contribution? Okay. So, I asked this slightly different question in the poll. How much of your current job do you feel makes a meaningful contribution to the world? I thought that one of the responses and discussions in Graeber's book was that maybe he could have asked the question in a slightly more nuanced way, so people could say, as I asked, is it all of my work, most of my work, less than half of my work, very little of my work, none of my work? So there I've drawn the line for where the general population in West Europe and Britain is 40% not meaningful. So down, I've scaled this actually upwards in a positive direction, so meaningfulness is upwards. These are managers of preventive conservation services. I've done the groups for which I have usable statistics, number of people in each group. So managers are quite content. And surprised me is they're actually feeling better about their work than even people that do preventive conservation or care of collections. So you're starting to see a bit of dark blue. Very little of my work, 10% of you. Still, we're well above the 60% line. Conservation scientists, there are some cranky, unhappy people. There's actually 2 people that said none of my work. I'm really tempted to track down their IP addresses, but maybe they misunderstood the question. They really wanted to say, I'm so damn happy. And then treatment conservation, pretty happy, but there's still some numbers there that are very little of my work. And then everyone else, all the others were more or less around the average. So I'm not sure I want to be called a conservation scientist necessarily, because we are the slightly grumpiest. Why does our work feel so meaningful? So that was my question. Well, now that this community confirmed that you feel kind of like me, I mean, 70%, 80% feel that your job is mostly meaningful. So why does it feel so meaningful compared to a lot of other white-collar workers? They know they're contributing to the economy, but that's not the same thing as feeling meaningful. Well, it's this wonderful, magical world of authenticity. And this is a very recent book from the Harvard Business Review Press. And you may ask yourself, what the hell does the Harvard Business School care about authenticity? Well, apparently it's what consumers really, really want. And this book is going to help people in marketing and business to understand what is authenticity. And in fact, if you're interested, they have a very good conceptual scheme for methods, kinds of authenticity. And as they point out, their scheme for kinds of authenticity is almost one-to-one with the World Heritage Congress's scheme for authenticity in world sites. Although they feel, I think, in the way they wrote it, that they came up with the good idea first and that World Heritage confirms their approach. One might argue with that. I think what it is that these great minds all converged on the same thing, because there are some universals in play here that people are discovering. Nobody's inventing authenticity. It's a discovery. We know that in general things like traveler's guides and whatever, there is a general discussion about fakes. Is it important that the doors there are, nobody wants to use the word fakes, especially not since 2016. We're going to say these are replicas which serve a purpose. So is this a masterpiece? Does it matter? Should you go and look for it? So it's something that's in the... I show this image to just emphasize how emotional people get about authenticity. This is probably one of the most polemical books written in conservation. The title is The Ravished Image by Sarah Walden. And here we have an evil conservator in a white lab coat sticking pointy metal things and syringes into the wonderful docile painting. Now, if you go looking for other books with the title Ravished in them, and first you should turn Safe Search onto strict, because you'll get a lot of images you can't show at an international congress. And then you're left with all the Viking stories. And the Vikings also arrive with sharp, pointy metal things, and there are women, docile women, hanging around waiting to be apparently ravished by the Vikings, or for their great-great-granddaughters to read about it vicariously. So it's a very emotional and loaded notion. So there's irrational things at play here. And we've known that for a long time, although we often get into discussions of patina and authenticity and so on, and it becomes a whole lot of rational arguments, very much like climate change. And all the research is quite clear that that's heaping up more science and facts doesn't change people's opinions. You got to go underneath that. In the last decade, there's been a lot of psychological research on authenticity and its precursor, the essence of things. And I will be using the word essence throughout this talk. So this is a study in 2008 by Hood and Bloom. And they brought in children and they set up these machines which were magical Star Trek replicators. They actually used some scientific equipment with bells and whistles and buzzing and noises that they could turn, and they added these boxes above, and then they did some trickery behind. But they established in their study that the children truly believed that this was a replicating machine. That wasn't difficult. So between 3 and 6 years old, they would close the machine up with a toy in it and then say, there's a replica with a stuffed toy, and it's easy enough to buy 2 identical toys. And they'd ask the children, which one do you want, the original stuffed toy or the perfect replica? And the fact is that the children chose randomly, half and half. There was no significant difference between those two. Then the researchers asked the parents if some of the children had attachment objects, you know, a towel or a soft, squishy thing that the child is attached to. And these were 3 to 6 years old. First of all, they had to reduce the number of participants in the study because a number of children simply refused to allow their attachment object to be replicated. So no, hands off my authentic blankie because it's authentic. But the children that did agree nervously to have their authentic object put into the machine, and then they closed it. Now, of course, they couldn't use trickery to make a perfect replica. So they'd already established for the children what the machine did, and then they asked them, we've got a replica on the other side, which one do you choose? And the majority of them, by a substantial margin, chose the original, authentic one. And when they were asked why, they gave completely reasonable answers like, because it's mine. And of course, I'm the source of its authenticity. It's been in contact with me. So essence of this kind of authenticity is not reproducible, although they clearly understood that a stuffed toy or the material world could be perfectly reproduced. Then they taught the children the value, how to use money and tokens, and they established which children did understand that tokens represented value and that you could use this to assign value. So they used this as a protocol for establishing where do children put value on things. Now they realized that under the age of 6, children were not clear on the concept of tokens as value, so this was only done with the 6-year-old children. And they had a silver goblet, and they made a perfect silver goblet, and they explained to the children that silver was very precious, a precious metal, but that the other goblet was perfectly the same. And again, what happened was children divided their money up between the two equally. There was no significant difference. Of course, there were some children that did one way or the other, but there was no trend. So silver is reproducible. That kind of precious is reproducible. Now they said this was the Queen's silver goblet. And they were going to replicate it, and they presented 2 real silver goblets. And the children assigned up to twice as much of their tokens to the Queen's authentic silver goblet. So the essence of this authenticity is not reproducible, and not only that, it adds value. So this is in place already in 6-year-old children. And it's something which I'm going to continue to call essence, but I may slip into saying it's magic. This is a study done where we can, similar kind of researcher, this is a year later, they couldn't use actual objects, so they made photographs of a real Picasso painting, a real object, the very first light bulb, a real handwritten Beatles lyrics, and the very first Apple computer. And they also paired these with a picture of a poster, a picture of a perfect new light bulb from the store, a Beatles album CD, which is probably, you know how old this study was. You wouldn't present a CD now and say that was a new item. Necessarily, and a new Apple computer. These were called the Original Creations Group. They did a famous person group, and they did personal items group. They actually did 3 other groups, but I won't be going into it, so it's quite an elaborate study. And they're looking to see, the question to the children was, which one belongs in a museum, and which one would you want to have? So in the question, which one belongs in a museum, they're looking for, do they have a sense of what a museum is in terms of collecting authentic objects? They established that first. And then they wanted to see if children could segregate these originals and visually similar. So they used visually similar items. It's another light bulb. It's another image. It's another bunch of music. It's another computer. Amongst the personal stuff, there was Britney Spears bubble gum, which I mention it, A, because you can find gifts of Britney Spears chewing gum, and 2, because it was a real outlier. It's an example of something which is really unlike every other category thing. There was Marilyn Monroe's sunglasses and John F. Kennedy's tuxedo. People understood those as famous people's things that are legitimate to talk about being in a famous person's museum. But a wad of bubble gum was kind of beyond the pale. Thank God. Although I'm sure there will be museum conservators writing on conservation diss list in a few years. Anyone got any ideas about preserving Britney Spears bubble gum? Why don't you call up the Revlon Museum of Cosmetics? They use a lot of latex there. So they looked at 4 years, 5.5 years, 7 years, 10 years, and 19 years old. Now, in order to establish that the children did have a clear concept of a museum, and this impressed me, 4 years old said, a thing that has old things that they don't use anymore. It's remarkable. It's, they've got it pretty down pat there. A place where famous discoveries are put. Somebody went to the Science Museum. 6 years old, a place where you get to see special stuff that is very fragile and special and amazing. 10 years old, a building that has to do with a certain thing, with stuff in it that you can learn about, like trains. So train watching starts really, really early. I'm not going to get into nature versus nurture, but I am presenting throughout this talk developmental studies that show when do we start to get this sense of authenticity. And as you can see, it's in this age group. So I'm reminding you on the left is some 2 5-year-olds. Try to guess which one's me and which one's my twin. And a sister that's 10 years old. And there I am being quite full of myself as 19 years old on the far right. So the question that's posed is, if you're selecting authentic objects or inauthentic objects, how many out of the 4 did the children or adults say belongs in a museum? Well, around the age of 5, so on the left side of the screen, they're around the gray line, which is they essentially pick 2 and 2, so it's random. We don't know whether they're just picking whatever. They're not clear. There's no clear effect. By the age of by the age of 6, we're starting to see an uptick. By the age of 7, it's clearly kicking in. By the age of 10, it's fully adult in its response, except for, I put the personal one in there because that's interesting. But at the age of 10, my grandmother's wedding ring or a love letter from my dad to my mom, these are authentic, important, personal things which should go in a museum when you're 10 years old. But by the time you're 19, you're thinking, well, they're authentic and they're real, but maybe not a museum unless I set one of my own up, like Orhan Pamuk, and make a fictional, real, authentic museum of things. So in the poll, I said, recall a time when you viewed a work of art or an artifact that made a profound effect on you. Imagine that later, at home, you were told by someone that the work of art or the artifact is a reproduction. How would you feel? And please give one word. Now, some of you don't follow instructions very well and gave me a whole sentence because it's really, really, really hard to condense it down to one word. And it's really, really useless to me to have anything more than one word when I'm trying to process the meanings of words into a wordle. But for the 90% of people that did follow instructions, mercifully. So you get told that after being moved and contemplating this Goya that, yeah, you know, we're not really sure about it. So some of the people said, these are the more positive or neutral. I'm surprised, I'm curious, I'm amused, thoughtful, puzzled, craftsmanship. Someone was into the part about molecule by molecule hadn't really registered. Craftsmanship, it's a Star Trek machine. We did it perfectly. But they're thinking of replicas. And then a number of people said it's okay. On the other hand, and the wordles here are proportionate to the number of answers, cheated, disappointed, betrayed, annoyed, defrauded, conflicted, and so on, which is what I was looking for and I was happy to get. Because my own sense when this happened to me was literally betrayal. And I don't have time to get into it, but the authentication process, which we contribute to within the museum, is incredibly important. Because when you remove that authentication, oh, we decided the analysis was wrong. Turns out it's by the school of, poof. There goes your sense of the meaningfulness of your experience engaging with that particular artist's work. So, in the future, if a machine can make absolutely perfect replicas molecule by molecule, would you care if museums decided to show only the perfect replicas? So, audience, who's going to vote probably no? Do you care? It's really, really perfect. Captain Kirk wouldn't know the difference. Well, he's an authenticity guy. He wouldn't know the difference. That's his whole shtick. No probably knows. Probably yes. Okay, nobody wants to commit. Would anyone really care about the replicas here? Yes? Oh, okay, good. So, what was the results of the anonymous poll? The managers ready for this? You did fine. You did better than anyone. Managers are a solid group in this field, or at least the ones that answer surveys. People that do preventive conservation of care of collections, there's a few there who would not care, but majority. Treatment conservation, again, surprised me. I thought it'd be the other way around. But then it started to make sense. We're in prevention, so we're not into intervention and manipulating it. It's like we really have to believe that we are doing something meaningful when we preserve the original. Otherwise, just make replicas every year. And here we have our grumpy scientists. Well, skeptical. Definitely would not care, almost 20%. So the stereotype about conservation scientists does have some merit to it. Soulless. Well, some of them. At 80, let's look at the bright side. 80% would care. That's a good thing. And then again, the others were more or less what you'd expect if you made an average of all of those within our field. I asked people if they have an attachment object as a child, because there are other articles, which I won't be mentioning, that have shown a correlation between whether someone had an attachment object as a child and how much they value authenticity and in things. So did you have an attachment object? And we're going to look at where they scored on definitely would care, definitely would not care about replicas. And indeed, if you had an attachment object, there's very few of you that don't care. And if you didn't have an attachment object, it's so sad. You don't seem to be able to necessarily attach to objects either. It's not a huge effect, but it's significant, it's measurable, it came out quite nicely. So an essence can transfer from a previous owner to people who come in contact with the object. This has been shown in various studies. I'm going to show one in particular. The same has been shown for transfer from a maker. I'll mention that actually these ones which were from makers, they actually said to people, this object was made by a craftsman. They did fine furniture. This object was made by a craftsman who spent a lot of time hands-on, and this one was made relatively quickly. It wasn't a lot of hands-on. And that very much influenced the level and degree of authenticity that was attached with the object afterwards. So, I think. Well, I couldn't resist using an essence, a spirit, a ghost, which of course various researchers and authors feel is what happens when you take the essence and give it a mind and power. It is part of what we would call a spirit or a ghost or some higher being. But it all comes out of our mind's ability, or not its ability, but its tendency to shorthand things into their essences. So that was an essence of a ghost, introducing the next person, who is Mr. Rogers. And Mr. Rogers is incredibly important to Americans who grew up in the 50s, 60s, 70s. He was the most popular children's show, and he would basically teach children how to be good people. I believe he was a pastor. He lived with his mother for most of his life. And actually, he was known for his red sweater. This is his red sweater in the Smithsonian Museum, so that people can bask in its essence. Turns out, I read that his mother was knitting one of these every couple of years because he would wear them out and they needed to look good. So there's a dozen authentic. But those are authentic because Mom made them. The question that's posed to the children is, or to adults, would behavior be influenced for the better? So suppose you give a child either the authentic sweater or replica sweater. Would the child's behavior in the future be influenced? And they asked 4- and 5-year-olds, and they're like, meh. Yeah, what? It's a red sweater. 6- to 8-year-olds, and again, we're seeing this 6 to 7 things start to kick in. They said, yeah, he'd probably behave a bit better. The most believing were the parents over the age of 18 who brought in the children. 80% said, this child will behave better because of what's transferred. So essence can be transferred. Actually, some researchers talked about it as in terms of contamination. I think that's an unpleasant word. If it's a serial killer's sweater, and there's a guy who's written one of the leading textbooks, and in his public talks, he hands out a sweater to somebody and then tells them afterwards, yeah, this was a serial killer. And depending on which country he's in, he names a serial killer that everybody knows. And people are horrified, disgusted, and truly angry. And that begs the question, why are their emotions becoming so moved by what is a sweater? Or why do we have historic famous people's museums? These are all related. And if you think this is all just side issues, here's probably the single most revered, respected, with a huge mausoleum built around it, Napoleon's jacket. with wonderful blue lighting. Reminds me of a 57 Chevy with blue lighting under the dash. People do genuinely walk reverentially around this, which all, again, comes back to if some visitor from another planet said, I don't get it, it's an old coat. Or then we have things like the Golden Pavilion. This was visited by Douglas Adams, who wrote Hitchhiker's Guide to the Galaxy. And he went to visit it for another BBC show, and he was mildly surprised at how quite well it had weathered the passage of time, since it had been built in the 14th century. And this is his writing. I was told it hadn't weathered at all, and had in fact been burnt to the ground twice in this century. So it isn't the original building, I had asked my Japanese guide. But yes, of course it is, he insisted, rather surprised at the question. But it burnt down, yes, twice. Many times, and rebuilt, of course. It is an important and historic building. So sometimes the essence really is of place. That's one of the advantages that sites and monuments have, is that there's an issue of movement, which I'll get to, which isn't such a problem. Whereas in artifacts and museums, that painting used to be in a church in the Piedmont, and now it's in London, or now it's in New York. It's been disconnected from its place, because essence can attach, of course, to a thing in its place and then merge. So there was a lovely study done to look at the issue of there's a riddle called the Ship of Theseus. That's what the philosophers like to refer to, you know, where if one board of wood from Theseus' ship is removed because it's repaired and put aside, and you keep doing this and all the boards are changed, is it the same ship? Or in the US, it's Washington's axe. In Britain, it's Potter's shovel. And every culture has these sorts of pleasant conundrums to argue over a beer about. So this researcher made a thing called a quiggle and presented images of it to children. He invented a word so that it wasn't necessarily an animal or a thing or whatever. It was indeterminate. And he said, Sam has to go away, and he'll come back in a while. And while he's gone, one of the pieces falls off Sam's quiggle and is put aside. But then it's replaced with a new little thing so that it's all together. And this happens numerous times, and you have the continuous quiggle and the reassembled quiggle. So the question is, when they ask the children, where is Sam's quiggle? And they know they're using this possessiveness term cleverly to not get into a lot of discussion with the children, but where is Sam's quiggle? You know, if this is a dog or this is his favorite paperweight, which one should he snuggle up to and value? Well, the conclusions overall is at the age of 5, whatever the case, children believe that Sam's quiggle is the one made of the reassembled original pieces. I would call this the logical material conservation opinion. By the age of 7, many switch to the continuous quiggle, the belief in an authentic essence that stays with the original whole. At age 18, adults, there's basically confusion. And because what you've done here is you've taken perfectly good heuristics, perfectly good operations of our minds to get through the day and not poison ourselves or get into a fight with the wrong person in the clan. And we have used words and a construction and a scenario to create a paradox. And although there are philosophers that think that this paradox is informative, there are other people in epistemology now and psychology writing, it's just a confusion. It really doesn't help inform how our mind works. It informs us of how, given that we know how our mind works, we can screw it up and confuse it. But the fact is there is an essence. So these have entertained people across many cultures due to the conflict between essence and materiality. And we see that throughout our literature, arguing about authenticity. Now here's a cute baby. This is my first grandson, so I couldn't help it. What a good-looking baby, and really, really intelligent, and social, and it's entirely nature and a little bit of nurture. He's got the tan-tan hairdo down pat. Object persistence, the visual system's heuristic for continuity. I'm going to talk about something a little bit different, but connected, and I'll pull it all together in a few minutes. So before psychologists and cognitive people were looking at authenticity in the last 10 years, back in the 60s, people were looking at this epistemological problem, or from more common experience, why is it that babies panic when mummy disappears behind the door and then reappears, and mummy's back, mummy evaporates, mummy comes back, but at a certain age they realize that mummy still exists and is still there even though they can't see that person. So the authentic mummy comes back. Now there are people with a mental disorder which relates to this who actually feel that all their relatives have been switched. And there are people that have an even severe case where they feel their own body has been switched. And one can see this in terms of a breakdown in the mechanism of assigning essence. We need this mechanism of assigning essence, or suddenly it's like, I'm a replicant. I'm in Black Mirror show, season 400, and it's lost. It's not. I remember such a strange feeling that you yourself are not in your authentic body because your mind's assignment of the essence of you has disappeared. So, but at a very basic level, visual persistence is like this. I'm going to show you this, and I'm going to ask you a question. Is that the same object? Was that the same? I'll show it again. And don't think about it, just like gut feeling. Is that the same object? Yes. Thank you. Is that the same object? Yeah, no. Could be, maybe, I don't know. You know, that was a real Picasso went in there, and it came out cleaner, but damn, it looks really too clean. It's lost its essence. It's not the same thing. I don't trust. That black box, conservation lab. Yeah. Is that the same thing? Just feeling, don't think about it. I'll tell you what actually gets pulled out by clever questioning in psychological studies. Color change is much less important. It's shape and form and velocity. It's spatial, temporal continuity. Mummy comes back with a sunburn, it's still mummy. Mummy plays around with her hairdo. I've seen it. It can be really dangerous. It can be dangerous for me, and I'm older than 6 years old. But color is less important, which is interesting when you consider like varnishing a painting. But one of the examples that is often given in this literature is, how do we know that brown banana is the same banana we put in the room yesterday? Because that's incredibly important to get you through your everyday world. And it's incredibly important, I think, within what we do in our profession. So here's the Brera Museum in Milan, and they set up one of these glass boxes that conservators love to be on display to the general public. I don't think this is only politics. I think this is fundamentally speaking to people's nervousness about the spatial temporal continuity of that painting. You take a painting in that's all brown, and then 2 months later, it comes back looking totally unlike its original, but you knew it as a conservator. You lived through it. You have spatial temporal continuity with that thing. The curator, the user, the viewer, it doesn't. It was a black box. It came out looking I'm not sure I'm going to assign the same essence to it. So this speaks to that. Bruce Hood, who did the first study I told you about on the Queen's silver cup, has written an entire book on supersense. He obviously takes the notion in a further direction, belief in religion, spiritual, fairies, all of that. These are extensions of our mind's tendency to assign essences to everything. So many of you have asked me, why the hell did you ask those 12 annoying questions in the survey about whether you believe in various kinds of supernatural thing? And this was I'll tell you, I didn't make up those questions. It's a standard test from, that was in the appendix of Bruce Hood's book. And it was a nice test because I also could get national averages of scores to compare to our results. So there was things like, it is quite possible for planetary forces to control personality traits. Who wants to vote probably yes? Thank you, Jonathan. Now, you see the advantages of anonymous surveys. The reason democracies have a secret ballot is because shame and groupthink is an incredibly powerful thing. But let's see what people honestly answered. And this is on a scale from 0 to 100. The maximum score is if you answered all of the 12 questions with like, totally agree. It's so totally true. Wow. And then there are people who gave 0%. It's bogus, bunkum. I'm a conservation scientist. And I don't care about replicas. And my job's meaningless. If you cared about replicas, your job would become meaningful. All right, this is the UK average, Brits. So I'm going to show the American average. Do you think it's higher or lower? Oh, you're also. It's a slightly more spiritual, religious, wacko kind of inappropriate. That will be deleted from the video feed, I hope. Put a black box, bleep me out. So I'm going to show the results from the over 150 results. So I have a full spectrum here, and we can see, and the gray dotted line is our community. We're actually more skeptical than the average Brit, which is getting pretty skeptical these days. But within an average, it hides some interesting distributions. I didn't have access to a distribution for the US and the UK, but it would probably be something like this. And I think there are two meaningful bumps. There's the warm reddish bump, which is, yeah, kind of, yeah, okay, I'm going to give this a probably horoscopes are real. I look at the paper and change my day. It's not a weather forecast, it's my life. And then on the left is the, yeah, okay, man, bluff. You know, if the planetary gravity could possibly move one of the electrons in the quantum state and blah, blah, blah. And then there's a solid 7 people that just went no to everything. And the reason the questions were reversed is you do this with questionnaires. Half of the questions were flipped in a negative way, so that if somebody just went down and went disagree on everything, they would cancel out, because 6 of them would be I disagree with this skeptical statement, and 6 would be I disagree with this positive supernatural statement. So that's a correction that's done in these sorts of things. So why did I ask this anyway, other than audience entertainment? So why ask about belief in the supernatural? So I'm going to show the cross-correlation between how people scored on the questions about belief in supernatural phenomena and how important replicas are in museums. And I'm going to look at this first. People who definitely would not care. Now, this is a histogram again. It's a population plot. But because the numbers are smaller, I can only do every 20%. Probably would not care. It's a little hesitancy. Maybe. We're starting to see people in the red who are believers. Probably would care. the skeptics are starting to leave, and the higher scores, and definitely would care, not significantly different, but essentially the top two is where all the red bars are, and those are the people who are, they both are valuing authenticity more, and they believe in supernatural phenomena more. And that's because they're essentially the same dimension. They're the same mental phenomena that's at play. So this is my model, and I think I'm actually going to get us out of here on time. So in the physical world, we have the Cipriana Potter violin of 1684, which is in the Ashmolean Museum. And it's a Stradivarius and all that that means. And there is visual continuity. People have, what authentication people would call the provenance is good. Not necessarily that somebody's been watching it for 400 years, but probably pretty damn close. I've been watching, you know, my great-great-grandfather watched it, and then he put it in a safe, and then he handed it on to the next buyer. So actually a huge amount of a truly solid provenance is visual continuity that people believe. So the initial perception and the spatio-temporal continuity gives us, in our mental world, this thing which is a violin. Now, the people that are researching this topic of essence from a purely epistemological, how do children learn that all those things which look so different are all violin, or all those things that look so different are all bananas in different state, which is, if you ask computers to do that before the advent of artificial intelligence, which just said, just try and learn like a human baby does, stop trying to do an algorithm, it was not so obvious at all. When people tried to actually synthesize how the mind does it, they just went, forget synthesis, let's just let the computer discover, as a child would, what is the continuity. And now we're in a situation where people that do artificial intelligence can actually, they will admit, we don't know what rules the computer discovered to tell it that those are all violins, or things more complicated like a criminal face, but it's reliable. It's just really, really reliable. Then there's evidence of origin and age and technique and patina, and these are the things that our field is very interested in. And then there's what Diane Aestop calls the biography, and that exists as physical objects that hold information within the physical world, and that's why documentation, and that's why dissociation is a 10th agent, and that's why maintaining the catalog and a safe place, a second copy, is if that's lost. Let's show what happens before it's lost. So if those things are strong enough, we now have an essence which is attached, not just to the essence as this is a violin, and I can just think of it as violin. And we don't know whether it's visual or a verbal or some other abstracted mechanism in our mind that holds concept of violin. But we do know if it's an incredibly important individual violin, we get this authenticity essence which is added. And the problem is if the biography disappears, you can switch that essence off. And you don't lose a little bit of it. The nature of an essence, and again, this has been studied with children, you can't chop it up into pieces. It's like a soul. In fact, souls, if you're not entirely religious like me, are an extension of this mechanism. And you don't divide up the soul like, oh, I can live without half my soul. I can live without one liver, or half a liver, or a kidney, but the soul is indivisible. And that's part of the reason people get into this dilemma with Theseus's ship. So let's go back to the violin. It has its authenticity. And now I'm going to do the Quiggle study. So you take a little piece away and you replace it. Where's the authenticity? Well, it's still sparkling and staying. You can't take a piece of it. And you take that piece and you put the new one back. And this is why it looks like a dilemma, and you take that piece away. I should have done smaller pieces, but you know, after the first hour of getting this animation to work, you need 3 pieces, they'll get the idea. So this is the classic paradox that is a game, is an entertainment, but which for some of us in our business is, how do you get that temple? Well, the temple was always there, and you rebuild on the site, and you rebuild piece by piece. And if the ship that burned down in Bristol is reconstructed, and there was a little bit there, its entire essence and authenticity from this perspective is still intact. So this is my concluding slide. I couldn't resist using the fifth element. Those of you that don't know the movie, this is one of the final scenes where the female character with the red hair turns out to be an alien that carries this, she's the savior figure. And this is her emanating white light up to the alien ship above, and she's the fifth element. I didn't realize at the time that quintessence, the fifth and highest element in ancient and medieval philosophy, is an old concept that Luc Besson worked with, and that they felt that it permeates all nature and is a substance that makes the celestial bodies. And I'm hoping you can see the extent to which this is what emerges from the 6 and 7 and 8-year-old mind as we develop a way of dealing with the physical world and to know what's important and what isn't and what's original. And so this particular quote is from one of the most recent articles I found, 2013, in Oxford Studies in Epistemology, and this author wants to bring back quintessence rather than simply essence, as trying to explain linguistics and how we see the world. The quintessence of authenticity is granted by the community. It's granted by the community. We, as a community, give authenticity. We assign it to objects. And then it's shared by the community. And as Bruce Hood concludes in his book, it binds the community. If we didn't have authenticity and a sense of essence in precious things, which is manifested most clearly in religious icons, but it's part of the same mechanism for those who would stand in front of a Picasso and be in awe because it's the real thing. The real thing exists in our mind. The creation of real things is in the mind, which is why marketers know that in Pepsi. Our work in preventive conservation maintains the physical evidence that supports the quintessence. But the reason I feel in the end that we do meaningful work, and I feel that we not only perceive that we think we do meaningful work, I'm trying to show that we are doing meaningful work. So we may be experts in the rational knowledge of authenticity, but we're ordinary people in terms of responding to the quintessence of authenticity. When we talk about connecting with the community, when we talk about listening to other people in decision-making, and there's been various articles in the literature, what this is an admission on our professional part that we may know the biography and the analysis of the object much, much better, but we don't have a better or deeper, necessarily, notion of the essence of these objects. It's the community. And yeah, if it wasn't the real Picasso or the real jacket of JFK, we wouldn't be hired to work on it. And we wouldn't feel meaningful just being a dry cleaners for a tuxedo. We're like Bruce Willis is to the fifth element in this film clip. We don't realize until the end, and when we look and see and feel the power of objects which have been rescued from a fire or an earthquake or just from neglect, that we are actually helping humanity to keep its spirits, its totems. And I would say to the young people here, especially if you're wondering whether you can find long-term meaningfulness in work in this field, even if, as Graeber points out, people in caring professions like teachers and nurses, everyone says those are really important jobs, but now we're not going to pay you very much money because they're so meaningful. I get $1 bazillion because my work is totally meaningless. I work at derivatives in the stock market, and I don't get much meaning from my job other than making money. So you should be happy as caretakers of the world. And do buy any babies' blankets if you find them. Thank you.
Stefan, what a wonderful, wonderful start to the Congress. Thank you so much. And I just loved your exposition of the essence of objects, because it chimes so much with my last few years of work at the National Trust and the work we did on Spirit of Place. And I'd never thought about it in the context of objects, oddly enough. So thank you. And just to say, Stefan did refer to the fact that this lecture is being videoed and it will be transmitted. We hadn't thought of censoring it, but I'm sure everything you said was absolutely fine. That will be on the IIC website. And there will also be well, not a transcript, but a written version, because, of course, the Forbes Prize Lecture is not included in the preprints. So, thank you again, Stefan. Okay. And we now have a coffee break, and Joe will tell us what to do.
I'm only going to tell some people what to do. Firstly, if you have come here with a grant from the Getty Foundation, the Brummel Memorial Fund, or TrueView, there is going to be a lunch for you at 1:05, so just after 1 o'clock. And that is over in the cafe called Mixto, and people will tell you how to get there. However, there is an important point. Please, could you go to the registration desk, and there is a piece of paper and a lady behind the desk, and please would you tell them if you are a vegan or you have to have gluten-free, and they have to know that now so that they can get the right stuff. The second thing is that if for the Getty Grant people only, please would you make yourself wait by the desk, because we have to sort out your per diem, which we're going to do in a different room first. The other notice refers to the buses. Some of you have already done that registration, but up until about Wednesday morning, please would you talk to the girl called Valentina, who's got beautiful hair like this, dark hair, on the desk, and she will tell you which bus you're supposed to be on. And the last thing is, and this is very important, if you are going to go to the closing reception at Palazzo Madama on Friday, could you please tell the people on the desk, simply because there is a limitation on the numbers, and it is a question of first come, first served. I know a lot of people are actually going home by then, so it may be okay, but there is another list. Please, would you sign that in the next 2-3 days, something like that. Could you be back after coffee at 1:45, please? Thank you very much.